By 1864, over 10,000 miles of iron trackway had been laid across Britain, and the rail network had spread out across green fields and through the centre of hamlets in all corners of the Isle. In London, just a year previous, the world's first underground rail had opened, and steam trains carved through the tunnels below the capital, bypassing the cluttered horse-drawn traffic in the roads above. This vast network had trampled the standards for time and size. Villages that had been days of travel away were now reachable within hours. News that similarly took days to disperse throughout the nation was now able to be reported, printed and distributed the same day. Goods could have a greater, more efficient reach, and labour markets had found a new freedom. For the more affluent, rail travel saw long-established class boundaries being dismantled and new wealth growing in unfamiliar locale. Rail travel fueled the Industrial Revolution as it carried tourists, workers, mail and newspapers to strict timetables wherever they needed to be. The landscape changed as towns shrunk and grew or found themselves host to a new rail line that ripped through the heart of their peaceful and at times historical villages indiscriminately. It was a shocking change for many, and writer and social critic John Ruskin commented on rail travel as the loathsomest form of devilry now extant, destructive of all wise forms of social habit and natural beauty. The trains themselves were self-contained carriages lit with a single gas light and with no joining compartments between, meaning that each carriage was essentially a locked room, speeding across its tracks at 60 miles an hour. This had caused a certain degree of alarm, as people questioned the safety of passengers who could not alert a person of authority if something untoward was to happen between stations. This fear wasn't entirely baseless, and had been fueled by a long-running backlash against the social progress that cheap, efficient travel had brought. This backlash manifested, as it so often does, in a campaign of fear, and papers such as Terry and Miller's The Invisible Plague, The Rise of Mental Illness from 1750 to the present, warned that rail travel could injure the brain with their jarring motions, unhinging the mind. Fears that a passenger could flip at any moment, turning madman in a locked room full of unsuspecting passengers, was very real for Victorian travellers. Punch, the satirical weekly, jumped on board and illustrated a map of Britain with an asylum and connecting rail networks to show how an escaped mental health patient could quickly make a getaway and wreak his or her particular brand of havoc. This fear of rail travel was widespread and deep. However, it was undeniable, even to the greatest critics, that this form of travel had brought new opportunities. Travel that allowed the lower classes to move their labour into the inner cities also allowed the more affluent to relocate themselves to newly emerging, leafy commuter suburbs. Thomas Briggs was one such commuter, having moved his family from the stuffy, pollution-filled streets of London to the spacious Hackney, now just 20 minutes travel to his place of work in the city, the financial and business district of the British capital. He was entirely typical, and one of thousands who had done the same. As the heat of summer crept over the horizon, his name was to stand out amongst the rest, stirring the undercurrent of fear, threatening to boil over. Thomas Briggs was born in Lancashire in 1795 and had moved to London with his family as a young teenager. He had married a woman named Mary and had 6 children, 4 sons and 2 daughters. The large family was well off, and Thomas, now aged 69, still worked hard as a head clerk in the bank of Messrs Roberts & Co. of Lombard Street in the City of London. In recent years, he had moved his family to Hackney and now commuted daily to work on the North London Railway Suburban Line, a semicircular track that connected Hackney to the heart of London. He was 5'9" and described as a stout and stalwart man who dressed in a waistcoat, silken top hat and carried a heavy cane and leather bag. He was the very picture of a middle-class Victorian city worker. On Saturday, 9th of July 1864, Thomas Briggs had visited relatives in Peckham for the evening and was returning home around 8:30 p.m, walking to Old Kent Road, where he took a bus to King William Street and stepped into Fenchurch Street, a station that served trains on the same Northern Railway line he used for work. He bought his first-class ticket and chatted with the ticket collector, who he knew well, being that he was a regular on the line. At 9:50 p.m, he boarded a train, settled down in the corner, placing his bag and cane on the seat next to him and relaxed, now on his final leg for his journey home to Hackney. At 10:01 p.m, the train pulled into Bow, at Hackney Wick at 10:05 and Hackney at 10:10. It was in fact running slightly late, and the conductor, Benjamin Ames, let out a sigh as he heard a commotion further down the platform coming from two men. Sidney Jones and Harry Vernus were clerks who were boarding the train at Hackney and had the unfortunate experience of opening the door to the same first-class carriage that Thomas Briggs had boarded just 4 stops previously. Thomas Briggs, however, was no longer there. Instead, they walked in on an empty carriage covered in blood. Benjamin Ames sent a telegraph ahead to Chalk Farm Station, where the train was to terminate, and completed the journey, ensuring no one else was to stumble into the macabre scene in the carriage. At the same time, Alfred Eakin was driving an empty train along the same track in the opposite direction, headed for Fenchurch Street. He'd passed through Hackney Wick and was about a third of the way to Bow when he noticed a dark shape lying on the bank next to the train tracks. He pulled the train to a stop, jumped onto the gravel and headed back to see what it could be, so that he could remove it from the trackway. Expecting it to be an unfortunate animal that had strayed a little too close to the line, as he stepped closer, he found instead, to his shock, the body of Thomas Briggs. Briggs was in a poor state, with several head wounds, but faintly alive, and Alfred Eakin alerted the help of passers-by further up the bank to help him to carry Briggs to the Mitford Castle pub, an establishment that backed onto the line. There, P.C. Dugan was the first official to the scene in the Mitford Arms. He had spotted the men carrying Briggs's lifeless body from the tracks and immediately headed in the pub to see what was going on. Upon searching the body, he removed a diamond ring, several pounds in cash from his pockets, as well as several letters. The letters were addressed to Roberts & Co. Bank, and so he sent for a member of the bank staff to come and identify the man, which, along with the letters, was promptly confirmed to be that of Briggs. By 2 a.m, his family had been contacted, and Briggs's son arrived in the Mitford Castle. He accompanied his father as he was removed from the pub. The following day, Thomas Briggs passed away from his injuries, consisting almost entirely around his head, leaving him with deep wounds and a fractured skull, attributed to having been struck by a blunt instrument, along with gashes by his left ear across his temples that were thought to have occurred as he fell or was thrown from the train. Back in Chalk Farm Station, the bloody carriage sat silently on the tracks, waiting for the murder investigation to begin. In 1864, any form of detailed forensic police work was still a glint on the horizon. Chemistry was not yet used, nor microscopic evidence. Even basic fingerprinting would not be used widely by police until 1891. Detectives, a relatively new concept in themselves therefore, had to deduce the ins and outs of crime scenes from the evidence they could see plainly before them. Walter Kersey was the first detective to step aboard the quiet carriage, now sitting quietly at Chalk Farm Station, and given the tools available to him, he deduced a considerable amount about the crime. The door handle was bloody. A large quantity of blood appeared to have flowed profusely from the corner seat. There was also a small quantity of blood on the window, 2 spots, like splashes. From this, along with the fact that Thomas Briggs was not a small man and the attack was quick, over in around 3 minutes given the position of Briggs between the 2 stations, the detective deduced that he had been asleep, with his head against the window at the time of the attack, and was therefore unable to mount any sort of defence. He also concluded that from the amount of blood on the door handle and the fact that Briggs had no blood on his own hands, the killer had thrown Briggs out of the train himself, quashing earlier suspicions that he may have jumped out of the train to avoid a robbery or assault himself. Kersey also found Briggs's stick, his bag and a crushed beaver hat damaged in the assault. A gold jump ring, usually attached to a piece of jewellery, most notably a watch chain, was also found, crushed into the floor of the train car. Seeing as how no watch or chain had been found on the body of Briggs, robbery was concluded to have been the motive for the attack. The police took the items to Briggs's family, who confirmed that both the stick and the bag had belonged to their father. However, no one recognised the hat. Thomas Briggs wore a silk top hat, much more costly and suiting to a man of his station than the beaver hat the detective had retrieved. The family also confirmed that Briggs was indeed carrying a gold watch on a chain and described it, including serial numbers. This initial inspection of the train car had given police two important leads on the case. The first being the missing jewellery. If it was a robbery, then it would be highly likely that the culprit would be looking to sell it on somewhere. And secondly, the mysterious beaver hat, which just so happened to bear the name of the maker in the lining, J.H. Walker of 49 Crawford Street, Marylebone. The next day, the press reported on the murder. It was the sort of story the public could feast upon, and the press were well aware sensationalist reporting of gruesome murders were already a staple, and this particular crime had an added twist. It was the first murder to have been carried out on a train in Britain. With rail travel already eyed suspiciously at best and outright feared at worst, the story stoked the public's imagination by pointing out that Thomas Briggs was a first-class passenger and described him as a gentleman, striking a blow to the middle classes, and at the same time making a point that the murderer must also have looked just like any ordinary, well-put-together member of the public to have been able to board a first-class carriage without suspicion. Death, they were told, was lurking in every traveller's shadow. Worst of all is the horrid consciousness not merely that you are uneasy, but that you are making the traveller in the opposite corner uneasy too. You know as the train rolls on that though he may pretend to be looking out the window, your vis-a-vis is keeping half an eye on your movements, just as you are keeping half an eye on his. The police were well aware of the perception of the case by the public, looking to resolve the ordeal as quickly as possible, both to allay fears and to avoid criticism in the press. They appointed Inspector Richard Tanner as a lead detective. Inspector Tanner was considered brilliant, and at only 31 years old, he was an ambitious rising star in the Met Police. He quickly set about business by measuring the distances between stops on the Northern Line, and concluded that the attack had taken place between 10:01 p.m. and 10:05 p.m, taking a maximum of 3 minutes from start to finish. Witnesses around the station were not forthcoming, and it appeared no one had seen any suspicious person leave Hackney Station on the night of the murder, nor any persons covered in blood. The possibility dawned on the police that perhaps the murderer had left the train as it slowed and took off across the tracks in the opposite direction of the station itself to avoid detection, and if that was the case, it was highly unlikely anyone would have caught a glimpse of him. Likewise, the hunt for a murder weapon was unfruitful, and the police eventually decided that it was most likely that Briggs had been attacked with his own stick, which was a weighty, heavy affair. Though the amount of the blood on the instrument caused some debate, with nothing else found, it was the best the investigation had. A reward for information of £200 was issued, quickly rising to £300. £100 was pledged each from the North London Railway, the government and Briggs's workplace, the Roberts & Co Bank. This was a substantial sum in 1864, equivalent to several years' wages for a craftsman. The same appeal also offered a pardon for those that may come forward with connections to the murder, providing they were not the murderer themselves. Tanner ordered 2,000 posters printed, providing details of the case, including a description of the hat and the offer of reward, and then he had them pasted all over London, outside of newsstands, rail stations, and reprinted in newspapers across the country. After the reports in the press, the public interest soared, and thousands of letters were sent to their offices. Most of them were hoaxers claiming to know more than they did, or suggestions for the police on how best to handle the investigation. Regardless, all leads had to be followed up on. One letter, however, stood out and held more promise than a lot of the others. It was a letter from Mr. John Death, a pawnbroker who opened a shop in Cheapside and who claimed to have dealt with a watch chain matching the description released by police. Inspector Keresy visited Death immediately and confirmed that a man speaking good English, but with a German or possibly Swiss accent, had come into his shop to pawn a chain worth £3 10 The man, he said, had swapped the chain with one valued at £3 5. He had also taken a small finger ring with a white stone to make up the difference. He couldn't give any detailed description of the man, however, as he had acted suspiciously, seemingly trying to avoid direct eye contact. The next breakthrough came on the 9th day of the investigation when a cab driver named Jonathan Matthews stepped forward offering information on a man he knew who owned a hat that seemed to match the Beaver hat found in the train carriage. Initially, Inspector Tanner was not impressed by Matthews and described him as such. His manner appeared mysterious. There didn't appear any truth in him. The police found it odd that it had taken Matthews so long to come forward and assumed he had eyes on the reward money. Nevertheless, the cab driver certainly had a story, and if it was to be believed, he also had a name for the man. Jonathan Matthews had had a somewhat rocky past, but he was now settled in London, living with his family and driving a cab. He was acquainted with a young German tailor by the name of Franz Muller, a friend of the family who often came to dinner. There were some questions concerning Matthews and Muller's relationship, specifically that Muller had, it seems, to have been engaged to Matthews' sister-in-law at one time or another, though the relationship had seemed to have broken down. Franz Muller was a 25-year-old German born in Saxe-Weimar. He had apprenticed as a gunsmith in Germany, though he had turned tailor after he immigrated to England in 1862, where he presumably met Matthews' sister-in-law, and then through association, Matthews himself. Once, at dinner, Muller had remarked on how he liked Matthews' hat, and the pair struck a deal that Matthews would source another the same in exchange for Muller making him a waistcoat. The hat was a Beaver hat made by the self-same J.H. Walker as the one found aboard the train car. Muller had also left an empty jewellery box after Matthews' young daughter had taken a shine to it, and the jewellery box was stamped with the name and address of Deed's pawn shop. Matthews' story was a solid lead on the case, though it did have some inconsistencies. Police questioned Matthews on why it had taken him so long to come forward with the information. However, he replied that he had simply been unaware of the story until he had heard gossip concerning the murder floating around his taxi rank. Regardless, he supplied the police with not only Muller's name, but his calling card too. These calling cards were quite a fashion item in the day, and they were furnished with a photograph. Muller's too had a photograph, along with his address where he lodged. Inspector Tanner wasted no time in tracking the address. When he rapped on the door to 16 Park Terrace in Bow belonging to a Mr. and Mrs. Blythe, his spirits were quickly dashed. Franz Muller had indeed lodged at the address for the past 2 years, and police found a hat box in his room that would have once contained the Beaver. Mrs. Blythe prior found it all quite strange, and she told Inspector Tanner that Muller was a quiet, well-behaved, inoffensive young man of a human and affectionate disposition. This was not the description Tanner was expecting. Furthermore, Muller was no longer residing with the Blythes. He had left, Tanner was told, 3 days prior, on the 16th of July, aboard a ship bound for America named the Victoria. Tanner had little time to waste. He requested permission to chase Muller across the Atlantic. If Muller arrived in America, there was every chance he could slip away from justice, and this was not an outcome that Tanner was relishing. The ship Victoria was a sailing ship, and that meant that the police had one advantage over Muller. An arrest warrant was granted, and Tanner left for Liverpool the same night aboard an express train, taking both Deeth and Matthews to gain passage on a much faster steamship named the City of Manchester. Steamships were significantly faster than sailing ships, meaning that the entourage could land in New York before Muller and await his arrival, allowing them to catch him unguarded and place him under arrest. On the morning of the 20th of July, they set sail from Liverpool. The journey would take 2.5 weeks, during which time a void of information would appear. The story of Thomas Briggs's murder that had captured the public's imagination, knocking even news of the American Civil War off the front page, would be left to stew as news of the transatlantic chase and extradition hearing in America would drip back across the ocean.